Hello, all. This is another reading from The King's Messenger by Carolyn Clare Givens, illustrated by Stephen Hesselman. This is Chapter 2, The King's Silence. First, a reading from Psalm 123. To you I lift up my eyes, O you who are enthroned in the heavens. Behold, as the eyes of servants look to the hand of their master, as the eyes of a maidservant looks to the hand of her mistress, so our eyes look to the Lord our God, till he has mercy upon us. Have mercy upon us, O Lord, have mercy upon us, for we have had more than enough of contempt. Our soul has had more than enough of the scorn of those who are at ease, of the contempt of the proud. Psalm 123. Now back to the story. If you remember, Smuggins had just been crowned because the king said that he was his greatest messenger. So let's get back to the story. It had been a few weeks since the king had given Smuggins a crown. Smuggins was so proud of the gift, but the king still had not called on him for a task. Smuggins began to wonder why the king gave him the crown. Really? He thought. What did I do? Can the king be right? Was I really serving all along? Even the king's messengers doubted. When they gathered before and after their time in the king's courtroom, Smuggins' crown was the main topic of conversation. I still don't understand what the king meant, Anikin said to Moggins. I wait in between each task he gives me, Moggins replied, his voice scornful. I should get a crown too. Misha, Sasha asked, why did you say Smuggins was the greatest? Because, well, that's what I think, Misha answered. You know, Smuggins, you still haven't proven yourself as a messenger. You're just a person who can stand in the king's courtroom, Dagon sneered. Smuggins listened to all these comments and began to doubt as well. He stood in the king's courtroom each day distracted. His thoughts were on what everyone else was thinking and saying about him. One day, the king called on Aniggins. Aniggins, step forth. At your service, your majesty, Aniggins said, stepping forward, his voice deep and gravelly. Okay, hold on. Let me try that again. At your service, your majesty, Aniggins said, stepping forward, his voice deep and gravelly. Smuggins was so caught up in his thoughts that he didn't even hear the king's message for Aniggins. There's a messenger who's really served. What was the king's thinking? I am not a good messenger. He's never even called on me. Aniggins is the longest serving messenger, and the king called on him again today, not on me. Daggins is right. I've never proven myself as a messenger. Smuggins suddenly remembered where he was, and turned his attention to the king's throne in time to hear Aniggins say, Yes, your majesty, and leave the court with a scroll in his hand. Smuggins shook his head, trying to focus, and the king's sharp eye caught the movement. The next day was a busy one in the king's courtroom, but Smuggins had difficulty focusing on what was happening. His mind was filled with a comment that Moggins had made that morning before they entered the king's presence. You're a disgrace to the office, Moggins had said. You should just resign. A disgrace? After all my life being ready to serve, I'm a disgrace? Moggins had been to China and back in service. Even if the king called on me today, I would never catch up to all the other things all the other messengers have done for him. Forgetting even to look willing, Smuggins spent the day caught up in his own thoughts. He thought about all the things the other messengers had done and compared them to his own service, waiting in the king's courtroom. All day long, merchants and noblemen came and went as the king went about his business. The kingdom was thriving, and the centerpiece of it was the dais in the front of the room. The king spoke with businessmen and knights, ambassadors and peasants. He instructed some, he learned from others. He went about his normal business of the day. Only one thing was different. That evening, after the messengers had left the king's courtroom, they gathered together for an evening meal. Misha sat down next to Smuggins. Do you know what's wrong? Misha asked him. Wrong? Smuggins replied. What do you mean? The king didn't call on any of us today. Do you know why? He didn't? Smuggins looked at her, surprised. Then he tried to recover himself. I'm as baffled as you are. You didn't notice? Misha's eyes grew wide. Smuggins, weren't you paying attention in there? Smuggins stuttered. No, I wasn't. He quickly turned away, not wanting to see the look of disappointment on Misha's face. Niggins was sitting on Smuggins' other side, and when he turned, glanced over at him. Perhaps, Niggins said aloud to the table in a mocking voice, perhaps the king simply wanted us to feel like Smuggins for a day. Everyone at the table laughed, and Smuggins felt his face turning red. He stood from the table, knocking his knees against it as he did so, asked to be excused, and left the room. The next day the messengers filed into the courtroom and stood at attention along the wall. As the king began his business for the day, Smuggins tried to pay attention, but soon he began to think about Nigginson's comment the night before, and the laughter of the other messengers. All the king's gift had done is make me a laughingstock. I've waited to serve the king my whole life. It's not my fault he hasn't called on me. I deserve better than to be laughed at by the other messengers. I may not have done everything a Niggins has done, but I've been faithful. The king shouldn't have even singled me out. At least before I got the crown, the other messengers weren't against me. Now all they do is make fun of me. Smuggins again spent the day caught up in his own thoughts, distracted by the things the other messengers had said, and comparing himself to them. He was so wrapped up in himself that he didn't notice that the king again failed to call a messenger all day long. That night the messengers once more discussed the king's strange action. They were so concerned by it that not a single one had time to sneer at Smuggins. But Smuggins barely noticed that either. For 7 days the pattern continued. Smuggins was caught up in his own thoughts, blaming the king, angry at how things had turned out, hurt and upset by the comments that had been made, doubting that he deserved to be a messenger. And for 7 days the king did not call a single messenger to step forward. He never looked in their direction or mentioned them. There was even a time that the king went on an errand himself, that he usually reserved for a messenger. And for 7 days the messenger discussed his odd behavior over dinner. On the evening of the 7th day, Misha sat down next to Smuggins again at the table. She turned to him and said as bravely as she could, Smuggins, you shouldn't be distracted from the king. Smuggins looked at her, a little surprised. What do you mean? He asked. For this whole week, you've barely noticed that the king isn't calling on his messengers. You're not even worried about it. He never calls on me anyway, Smuggins defended. Why should I be worried? But, Misha stuttered, you've always been ready, even when you weren't called on. That's why I said I thought you deserved the crown. But the king agreed with me, remember? Smuggins was quiet for a moment. Yes, I remember. You didn't work to get that crown, Misha continued, her words spilling out quickly. You didn't even think you deserved it, and really, there was nothing you did to get it. You waited. You trusted the king that he would use you at the right time, and when people were upset that he gave you a gift, you got wrapped up in that. You worried about what they thought. So much that you didn't even seem to care what the king thinks anymore. Smuggins was silent. Misha was right. He had forgotten what it was like to trust the king's judgment. That was what had mattered all those years, even when people whispered about why Smuggins was never called. What they thought hadn't made any difference, because he knew the king was right. Smuggins spent the whole night thinking about what Misha had said. The next morning he went into the king's courtroom with the other messengers, hoping in his heart that the king could forgive him for being so distracted for so long. There was not a moment that morning that Smuggins took his eyes off the king. He watched every move, hoping the king would turn and smile or give him some other sign of forgiveness. And as he watched, he began to notice every motion the king made. For years, Smuggins had watched the king, and he knew, as only a messenger could, that what every gesture meant. He knew when the king was tired or upset or angry or hurt. Smuggins was a messenger. He was supposed to watch the king. About midday, when a knight arrived to address the throne, Smuggins saw the king moved his left hand ever so slightly toward the wall. "At your service, your majesty," Smuggins said, stepping forward. Everyone in the courtroom but the king turned to stare at him. The other messenger's jaw dropped. The king smiled and slowly turned from the knight to face the line of messengers. "Smuggins," he said, his voice filled with joy. "You wish for something, your majesty?" Smuggins asked. "Yes, I did," the king replied. "How did you know?" "Your left hand, your majesty. You always make a slight gesture toward us before you call one of your messengers." The king stepped down from his dais and came toward the line of messengers. "I have not spoken to you with words for 7 days, but this is the first time one of you has answered my call." The messengers bowed their heads in shame, but the king spoke again. "Do not be sad. It was much to expect of you." Then he came face to face with Smuggins, gripped his shoulder. "Smuggins, I only ask you to keep your eyes on me." And that concludes our reading for Chapter 2 of The King's Messenger by Carolyn Clare Givens, illustrated by Stephen Hesselman. Please, if you're inspired by this story, go on Amazon and pick this up for yourself to read over and over again to your children and any who visit. This is someone who has worked a long time on this book, and it's relatively cheap. I hope you enjoyed it.